the forgotten hero homeless veterans on trial. When the judge hears his name, the entire courtroom stands up. He entered handcuffed, head down, thin, wearing a worn coat that seemed to have survived decades, not seasons. His shoes were so worn that one of his feet barely touched the ground. His face showed something more than wrinkle. It reflected abandonment, too fragile to seem like a threat, too invisible to seem like someone. Antonio Ribeiro, 73 years old, no fixed address, accused of breaking and entering. The crime, having slept in the back of a bakery on a dawn when it was 4 degrees below zero, among empty sacks and the smell of stale bread. He just wanted to survive the night. The courtroom was cold, almost hostile. In the back, the prosecutor adjusted his tie, hurried. The defense didn't even show up. For everyone there, it was just another case, another homeless person disturbing the peace. Nothing that required special attention. But for Judge Larissa Montenegro, it wasn't like. Seated at the front, she read the file with eyes hardened by routine, turning pages unhurriedly until she stopped. Her gaze froze upon seeing the defendant's full name, Antonio Carlos Ribeiro. She felt her body go numb. An old memory, kept like a scar, emerged with force. It was the name her brother repeated in handwritten letters, always accompanied by the same phrase, "If it weren't for him, I wouldn't have returned." Enrique Montenegro, captain killed in combat 19 years ago. But before dying, he was the hero admired by a child who dreamed of wearing the uniform, a stubborn, silent, brave second lieutenant who saved him on the battlefield. She looked back at the defendant, head down, lost gaze, hunched shoulder. He was unrecognizable, and at the same time unmistakable. Time had destroyed him, but it was him. Larissa swallowed hard, tried to keep her face impassive, but the hand holding the pen trembled. The institutional coldness of the room seemed absurd to her in the face of that revelation. The hero of her brother's story, handcuffed for seeking refuge from the cold. While the prosecutor read the accusation aloud with indifference, Larissa barely listened. Everything sounded distant, drowned by the echo of Enrique's laughter, of letters that arrived smelling of sand and gunpowder, of stories that always ended in gratitude toward a man no one else knew. But now he was there, forgotten by everyone except her. When the prosecutor requested a penalty of movement restriction and community service, Antonio didn't react. He remained motionless, seeming to have already accepted whatever sentence the world would impose on him. Larissa, still silent, wrote something on a paper, folded it, discreetly called an officer, and handed it to him. The order was clear. Take it personally to lawyer Eduardo Ferraz. The officer left without asking questions. In front of her, Antonio raised his gaze for a brief second. Their eyes met. She wanted to say something but couldn't. Not there. Not yet. The trial continued, but everything had already changed. While the court followed its bureaucratic course, Larissa Montenegro seemed to be in two places at once. In the judge's chair, firm and silent, and in the past, listening to her brother's voice resonate in her memory. Enrique spoke of that sergeant as if speaking of a father. He told how he kept calm when everything became chaos, how he dragged wounded soldiers under crossfire, how he held his hand when he thought he was going to die. "He taught me more in 3 days in the jungle than the entire academy in 3 years, he wrote in one of his letters. If I return, I want you to meet him. But she never met him. Enrique came back alive, but not for long. And now, almost 20 years later, that sergeant reappeared, not as a hero, but as a defendant. Larissa didn't know if she felt anger, sorrow, or shame. Maybe all at once. In front of her, Antonio remained motionless. When he spoke, his voice was low, disconnected. He said he tried to knock on the bakery door, that he didn't want to invade anything. He just wanted a place where the cold wouldn't hurt so much. "I just wanted a corner to lie down. That was all." Those were the only words he pronounced that morning. Then the courtroom door opened. A tall man in a dark suit with a stern gaze entered. With a firm voice, he broke the silence. "I am Eduardo Ferraz, defense attorney. I assume representation of the defendant." The prosecutor barely disguised his disdain. "Voluntary defense at the last hour? Unacceptable." Larissa intervened without hesitation. "Accepted. Continue, Dr. Ferraz." Eduardo wasn't just any lawyer. He had a reputation, participated in high-profile cases, didn't usually appear in processes like this. But he was there for a reason only Larissa knew. Ferraz quickly skimmed through the file, asked direct questions, requested a recess, challenged the accusation. In minutes, he dismantled the prosecutor's argument, appealing to basic principles of humanity. There is no breaking and entering when there is no intention of appropriation. There is desperation, survival, and social abandonment. The prosecutor replied, "Speaking of repeat offenses." Eduardo responded, "What repeats here is not the crime, it's the negligence." The room fell silent. Meanwhile, Larissa didn't take her eyes off Antonio. he remained oblivious, as if in another world. He didn't seem to recognize Eduardo or even himself. But Faraz was beginning to suspect that man wasn't just any homeless person. There was something in his posture, even deteriorated. A certain firmness persisted, discipline buried by years of abandonment. At the end of the session, Eduardo approached Larissa in the hallway. "Tell me the truth. Who is he?" Larissa hesitated. "The man who saved my brother's life." Eduardo was silent for a few seconds, then answered without looking back. "Then we're not going to let this pass as just another case." Eduardo Faraz wasn't one to get involved on impulse, but that man moved. In the days following the hearing, he immersed himself in Antonio's past. He started with the basics: public archives, military records, decoration lists. But he soon noticed a pattern. Too many pieces were missing. Where he would expect to see detailed mission reports, he only found vague summaries. Where there should have been medical certificates, there were gaps. It was as if someone had gradually erased Antonio from official history. Obstinate, Eduardo went deep. He moved contacts in the army, pulled strings until a former client of his, now a retired colonel, was surprised to hear the name Antonio Ribeiro. That sounds like a true warrior. He was legend among the non-commissioned officers. How is it that he lives on the street? But no one knew where he had gone after his discharge. No one had seen him since then. For the system, he simply disappeared. At the detention center where Antonio was temporarily held, Eduardo tried to gain his trust. He brought coffee, clean blankets, asked questions that received scarce answers. Antonio barely spoke, spent hours staring at the ground. When he did speak, he mixed past and present as if still on the battlefield. He mentioned names unknown to Eduardo, and only one he recognized: Enrique. Enrique, that boy was stubborn. He had a destroyed shoulder but wanted to return to the shootout. He murmured without context one random afternoon. Eduardo watched carefully and patiently. One day he brought a folder, sat in front of Antonio, and took out a yellowed, faded photo of a group of soldiers in the jungle. One of them, younger, smiled sideways. He was wounded, but smiling. "This is Enrique Montenegro, isn't it?" Antonio looked and stopped. Time seemed to freeze. His eyes, almost always empty, came to life for an instant. His trembling hand rose and gently touched the image. His voice came out broken. "I dragged him by the vest. He was lying there with his leg full of shrapnel. He told me he wanted to go home, that he wanted to introduce me to his sister." Pause. "He called me stubborn old man." The silence that followed hurt more than any word. There Eduardo understood. That man still carried everything with him: the trauma, the guilt, the unfulfilled promise. That same night, Eduardo returned to his office and reviewed every line of what he had discovered. Finally, he found a way: a discreet mention of military files released by a recent declassification program. He accessed the portal, completed applications, and waited. 48 hours later, the names appeared. The mission, the ambush. Antonio Carlos Ribeiro acted under direct fire, saved 4 soldiers, and prevented the troops' collapse during a forced retreat. He was wounded, refused evacuation to continue helping. He received a decoration proposal, but the process was never completed. Everything was real. Eduardo printed the reports, marked the key passages. While organizing the papers, he paused for a moment, contemplating the table full of documents. There was a complete man, with history, with honor, with scars, a man the world preferred to forget. He picked up the phone. "Larissa? Yes, he didn't just save your brother. He saved an entire platoon, and then they abandoned." She took time to respond. When she did, her voice sounded firm but soft. "Bring everything. We're going to show the court who he is. But more than that, we're going to remind the country what he did." 2 weeks later, the courtroom was no longer the same. The one who before seemed like just another homeless person now had a renowned lawyer by his side, and in front of them, a pile of documents no one expected to see. Eduardo Faraz began his presentation calmly. He placed on the bench not only military reports, but also a timeline. He pointed out omissions, ignored names, forgotten protocol. He read fragments, underlined dates, showed copies of documents sealed by the army itself. Antonio Ribeiro, according to what was now official, had prevented the death of at least 5 soldiers during an ambush abroad. He had been proposed for the National Order of Valor, but the process was filed after his medical discharge. The room kept silent. The prosecutor, until then indifferent, arranged the papers in front of him like someone trying to reorganize their own argument. But at that moment, there was no argument left. Then Judge Larissa authorized the calling of witnesses. The first to take the stand was a tall, gray-haired man in dress uniform, retired General Augusto Marin. "Second Lieutenant Ribeiro saved my life. I was a lieutenant on that mission. A bullet hit my shoulder in open field. He dragged me almost 100 meters under fire. I never forgot it. But the system seems to have forgotten." 2 more ex-military followed, each relating how that man, who now could barely keep his back straight in the chair, had saved. Antonio listened in silence. He didn't seem to believe they were talking about it. Eduardo then requested the reading of a fragment from the declassified report. Second Lieutenant Ribeiro demonstrated high personal risk conduct, remaining in defensive position after securing the evacuation of 3 wounded soldiers. His voluntary permanence gained time to reorganize the platoon and prevented additional casualties. The entire room listened in absolute silence. Not the rustle of shoes nor the creak of leaves could be heard. It was then that Larissa spoke with a firm voice but glassy eye. What we have here is not just a process, it's the portrait of a system failure. A man who served with honor, who was forgotten due to administrative errors, and who now, by irony, is in the dock as a defendant when he should be being honored. She gestured toward the door. 2 military men entered. One of them carried a small blue box. Inside, a golden brooch, the National Order of Valor, a decoration delayed almost 20 years. Antonio looked at it without understanding. It took him seconds to process what it was. His first reaction was negative. "No," he murmured. "I couldn't save Enrique. He died because of me." Larissa approached without keeping protocol, not as a judge, but as a sister. "He lives thanks to you. He came home. He wrote to me. He described you as the bravest man he knew, and he asked me to find you." Antonio didn't respond. He just cried. And in that room that before only saw him as an invader, everyone stood up. The prosecutor, the court staff, the soldiers, the curious in the audience. No one said anything. No one needed to say anything. The judge took a deep breath. "The charges are dismissed, and the state must immediately initiate the regularization of all rights and benefits that by law correspond to him." Eduardo nodded. Antonio lowered his head, but this time not from shame. It was relief. The following week, what would have been an administrative procedure became an act of historical reparation. Antonio was called back to court, but this time not as a defendant, but as an honoree. The room wasn't full like before. There was no curious audience or hurried journalists. It was a more intimate, collected atmosphere. Eduardo was by his side, along with 2 officers from the National Army in ceremonial uniform, and Larissa at her bench no longer hid what she felt. She wasn't just a judge, she was Enrique's sister, someone who shared the same debt the country had with that. Antonio entered in new clothes, a simple but clean suit, trimmed beard. His body was still somewhat hunched, but different, not because of age, but because of the weight of the past, a weight that was finally beginning to lift. They called him to the center of the room. An officer read in a firm voice, "For proven valor in combat, high personal risk conduct, and direct contribution to the survival of armed forces members, the National Army grants with honor the National Order of Valor to Second Lieutenant Antonio Carlos Ribeiro." They opened the blue box. The metal gleamed under the room's light. But Antonio didn't move. He looked at the decoration like someone seeing a shattered mirror. He breathed deeply and spoke with a broken voice. "I don't deserve this." He died. The silence was immediate. Eduardo approached and put a hand on his shoulder. "But he lived long enough to return, to write, to thank, and to tell a sister that you were the reason for his hope." Larissa stood up and came down from the bench. "Death doesn't erase what was saved, Second Lieutenant. You gave time to my brother, and you gave our family more than words can express." Antonio squeezed his eyes shut. A sob escaped. He still carried guilt, like someone carrying an old rifle. "I only did what anyone would have done," he whispered. The officer placed the medal on him. Antonio held it with both hands, not knowing whether to put it on or simply contemplate. Finally, he closed his eyes and rested his forehead against it. "Thank you," he said with difficulty, "for not forgetting me completely." The next gesture didn't come from Larissa or the military. It came from the prosecutor. He stood up, straightened his posture, and saluted with a military bow. The entire room imitated him, not by protocol, but out of respect. That afternoon, the government made official the granting of lifetime pension, assisted living, and complete medical care to Second Lieutenant Antonio Ribeiro. The case was referred to the Ministry of Defense as a symbol of failure and reparation. And the press, which always arrives when it's already too late, sought headlines, interviews, and notoriety. But Antonio rejected. He just wanted silence and a place where he could finally sleep in peace. It was small, a room, a bathroom, a kitchen with a table with 2 chairs. But it was his. After so much time sleeping on cardboard, under marquees, on plaza benches, that silent apartment seemed like a castle. There was no luxury, but there was warmth. The walls had no humidity. The bed had clean sheets. The shower worked. Antonio spent his days in silence. He prepared coffee every morning like someone fulfilling a ritual. He watched the water boil, waited for the foam to rise, filled the cup carefully as if it were the most important moment of the day. And it was. The television remained off, the windows open. He liked the sound of the street, horns, footsteps, random voices. It was proof that he was back in the world. He received visits from time to time. Nurses, social workers, military personnel who came to check papers. But he only truly smiled when Eduardo arrived. He came unannounced, brought bread, fruit, city news. They spoke little, but when Eduardo sat down, Antonio relaxed. For the first time in many years, there was someone with whom he didn't have to defend himself. "Everything okay, Don Antonio?" the lawyer would ask. He would shrug his shoulders. "I'm learning to be at peace. It's harder than it seemed." Sleeping was still complicated. Sometimes he woke up sweating, hearing shots that no longer existed. Other nights he cried silently, hugging a blanket. But now there was something different. He knew he could close his eyes again, and that changed everything. One Friday afternoon, the intercom rang. It was Larissa. Antonio hesitated. He wasn't expecting her visit. He thought about refusing out of shame, but something told him he should open the door. He opened it. She was there with a folder in her hand and a serene face. "May I come in?" He nodded without saying a word. They sat at the kitchen table. For a few seconds, the only sound was the whistle of the kettle. Larissa put the folder on the table and slid it toward him. "These are letters from my brother. They were kept in my mother's house. Some I had never read." Antonio touched the envelope as if it were made of glass. He opened it slowly, carefully took out a folded letter. He recognized the handwriting. "Sergeant Ribeiro saved me, not just my body, but my mind. He taught me to stay calm, not to succumb to panic. He taught me what courage is. If I ever return, I want you to meet this man. He doesn't talk much, but he says everything with his action." Antonio read in silence, then another letter and another. Some spoke of the battlefield, others of fear, but all ended with gratitude. He breathed deeply and murmured, "For so long I thought no one remembered." With eyes full of tears, Larissa replied, "The world can forget, but whoever was saved never forgets." That night, Antonio slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The silence didn't hurt. Antonio was getting used to the new routine. The silence of that apartment was different from the silence of the street. Here it didn't hurt. Here he could close his eyes without fear of being kicked, awakened, or thrown out. He drank coffee slowly, straightened the crooked pictures on the wall, swept the floor, even though it was clean. He was beginning to understand what it was to have a plate. One random afternoon, the bell rang. It was Larissa. She brought a manila envelope, but this time it wasn't to be opened at that moment. She just said, "This is for when you're ready." But the most important thing, "Antonio, you made it. You came back." He nodded. He didn't respond. It wasn't necessary. When she left, he didn't open the letter. He left it on the table, sat by the window. Below, children ran in the plaza. It was sunny. A gentle breeze moved the tree leaves. A strange sensation of peace that he didn't recognize but didn't reject either. He stayed there, minutes, maybe hours, until he spoke, as if talking to the absence. "For so long I thought no one remembered." And for the first time he didn't seem to lament it. He just stated it. At that moment, someone on the other side of the plaza, a child in a military school uniform, ran by. He stopped, looked up, and waved at him. A simple gesture, without knowing who the older man in the window was. Antonio responded with a slight hand movement. He smiled, small, discreet, but sincere. If this story reminded you that no one should be forgotten, like it and write just one thing in the comments. I remember. Sometimes that's enough to honor those who deserve it.